Hello, everyone. Welcome back to That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. I am your host, Ryan Rogan, and if you've been listening recently, you know I haven't gotten through that intro without an error, so I'm actually pretty proud of myself to start the episode. Today's episode is about background checks, and you might be thinking those are pretty innocent, pretty normal, but sometimes they're not. And in doing some research, I learned that it's a wild world. There's not a ton of regulation, but I'm going to let an expert explain that to you after you subscribe to That Can't Be Right wherever you get your podcasts, and after you follow That Can't Be Right on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. You've done that. Excellent. Today, I am talking to Ariel Nelson from NCLC, the National Consumer Law Center, where she's an attorney and wrote a really interesting report about background checks and how they can be awful. So, Ariel, welcome to That Can't Be Right.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. Always exciting to talk about these issues.
Yeah. So, I think most of us listening have probably done a background check. I mentioned to you, I recently started a new job. And when I got my background check, I immediately thought of this conversation. 94% of employers, 90% of landlords are running criminal background checks. What does that look like in terms of dollars, volume, like the number of people affected?
So this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. Some of the latest numbers I've seen are that in 2020, the employment screening services market was valued at just under $5 billion and is projected to reach a little under $10 billion by 2028. And tenant screening, I saw around $5.3 billion by 2028. So lots of money involved.
That's a lot of money. I don't know how much money is exchanging hands for rent, but just to get into one, a place of employment, or two, a place to live, that's a lot of money. When did this process become so prevalent? When did it become the norm? And when did this multi-billion-dollar industry pop up?
My understanding is that the growth of the internet is really when this all exploded. And that's partially because public records like criminal records, are available online, and they started becoming available in these databases that you didn't have to just go physically to a courthouse, for example, to get them. You could access them online. And so that meant that a lot of companies could start taking advantage of that new accessibility.
Do you think the municipalities, the local governments, local police departments were prepared for what people could do with the information they were starting to digitize and put online?
It's hard to say. I'm guessing not. Although over time, there have been a lot of different ways that court systems, for example, have chosen or not chosen to make their records available. So, for example, you have some court systems where they will sell their criminal records in bulk to subscribers. So now they are saying, we know that there's a demand for these, and this is how we're going to approach that demand. Although I'm sure it took some time before they figured out exactly how to approach that. And depending on the system, they might be less technologically advanced, and their systems might be susceptible to things like screen scraping. So there are a lot of different ways that this information could be gathered.
I do want to talk about this more, but off the top, my first question is for the places that sell it, for the communities, whatever level of government that are selling it to companies, could I just walk in and be like, hey, I need your criminal records. How much? I am a random person off the street.
I think it might depend on the place who counts as a subscriber. And I think if you're a random person off the street, it's possible you wouldn't want to pay what they're charging, although, it varies. And I haven't looked too much in what individual places charge. But I will also say that a lot of places offer them for free. You just go to the court website, you type in the name of one of the parties or the case number, and there it is. So
yeah,
you might not need to pay. Some places I would actually say that these contracts, subscriber contracts, can be really helpful because then you can require certain things of your subscribers. And we can talk
Mm-hmm.
about that later, but there are ways to use that to the benefit of people whose records are being purchased, for example.
Excellent. So I jumped right into like kind of the logistics of background checks, but I'm also thinking of mugshots
Mhm.
as something that like people can access publicly and like end up. I mean, we see celebrity mugshots from 20, 30 years ago all the time. And I'll get to the point of that statement in a second. But first, like what purpose are the background checks supposed to serve? Like in a perfect world, what should they be telling potential employees and potential landlords about the person they're considering hiring or allowing to live somewhere?
So the idea behind them is they are addressing concerns about public safety, whether or not someone you're renting to or employing will be a threat to other employees or to the property of the business or rental housing, the likelihood that an employee or tenant meets their obligations, and also liability for employers and landlords. And I'll just say upfront that there is an assumption that the information that is in background screening reports will help employers and landlords make good decisions. But it's essential to question upfront whether that information is actually saying anything useful about whether a potential employee or a potential tenant will be successful. And the background screening companies have been really effective at saying what we're giving you is what you need to know, and this will help you. But we don't have a lot of information necessarily about whether that's true. We have more information about some aspects of it than others, but there's an assumption that more information is always better or this information says something. But I just want to put out there upfront that that isn't necessarily true and often isn't true.
Let's get right into that. Like, I would venture a guess that most of my listeners who number in the high dozens probably don't have any sort of criminal record. Maybe something as a juvenile, or maybe like speeding tickets, whatever. I would guess that none of my friends are smart enough to run criminal enterprises. What's the problem with background checks? Like you've already mentioned that like some places might give it to me as an individual, some places might charge for it, some places have different requirements. Is there any sort of regulation around this industry right now?
So there is some regulation around the industry, and I can get into that certainly in more detail, but I think it might be helpful to name two of the big problems with criminal records in particular.
Okay.
And one of them is it's important to think about who is most likely in this country to have a criminal record, and why is that?
Mm-hmm.
So what we know about our criminal justice system is that the people who are more likely to be charged with an offense, stopped on the road, whatever it is, are people of color. They are who is most likely to have a criminal record. And given what we know about whether or not those instances in which someone lands with a criminal record are fair or part of a bigger problem with structural racism, is it fair that these records are being used against those folks? So that's the first thing I want to flag. The second thing is even your friends who might not have a criminal record could still have a criminal history, a background screening report that says that they do. And that's because these reports are also full of errors. And the type of errors that your friends might experience is being tagged with somebody else's criminal records. And it could be really difficult to get someone else's records off your report. And so you might be denied a job based on something that has absolutely nothing to do with you. So those two issues are distinct, and I want to say that both of them are problematic. Uh, People who actually do have criminal records and people who don't but are tagged with them wrongly.
What responsibility do these background check companies like have to people who they misidentify or mistakenly attach a criminal record to the wrong Ryan Rogan?
You're very lucky. I will note you do not have a common name, so that
I
problem
do
is
not.
probably less likely to happen to you. Um,
Yes.
but so this is getting at the regulation issue. And there is a statute, a federal statute called the Fair Credit Reporting Act that governs background screening companies. And I think the key thing to mention here is that there is a requirement in the Fair Credit Reporting Act that these companies follow reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy. So if someone is tagged with somebody else's criminal record, then that individual probably would have the ability to challenge that in court. They don't have to go to court. There are ways you can just go to the company and file what's called a dispute and say, this is wrong, you need to fix this. But there are
Mm-hmm.
also legal remedies or remedies in court as well.
Got it. So we've focused on two of the big issues. One, like the inherent structural racism within the legal system, which would cause people to have a criminal offense on their record. Two, criminal records being attached to the wrong name. But what are the other issues? What other issues should we discuss before we talk about solutions, maybe?
So, first, before we leave, we had a discussion about what something like a criminal record says or doesn't say about a
Mm-hmm.
person. And I think it's important to highlight that there has been research showing that once a relatively short period of time passes after an offense, criminal history isn't a reliable predictor of future criminality. And we also know that the likelihood of recidivism declines sharply over time. And also that things like stable housing and opportunities for employment are associated with a reduced likelihood of recidivism. So we have all these factors suggesting that a criminal history, even if someone has a criminal history, that doesn't say everything about them. And two, that providing opportunities to people who have been locked out of them actually can lead to less issues with the criminal justice system in the future. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth saying that a criminal record on a background screening report doesn't necessarily say what someone might assume it says. And there's also the issue of there could be a landlord who says, I don't want anyone who's ever had a criminal record ever.
Right.
And that could be from a long time ago. It could be something that has nothing to do with whether or not someone will be a good tenant, So there are a
Yeah.
lot of, connections drawn when they don't need to be drawn.
So I think we'll also talk about like the content of a background check, but they're not. Oh gosh, there's so many places to go. Not all background checks are the same. There's not like a standard format, right?
So I'll say that they often have similar information in them, and you can
Mm.
typically pay to have more components. For example, do you want a 50-state criminal history survey? Do you want a sex offender registry survey? I think the part where what you're getting at in terms of standards is really about that the way these companies put together these reports or assess people, there are no standards around that per se.
Okay. So going back to like if someone committed a crime a long time ago and it was some low level offense, does the landlord know why they're rejecting someone? I guess is ultimately the question.
Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because, especially in the tenant screening space, there are a lot of reports we're seeing that simply provide an up down recommendation or something called a tenant screening score. And the landlord might not see the underlying information. Sure, they told the tenant screening company, these are the criteria I want, but they don't necessarily know any more information than the up-down recommendation. And so that makes it really hard for potential tenants to know what went wrong and then to be
Mm.
able to potentially fix it or tell the landlord, let me explain this situation, or the information you got is wrong. So there are a lot of layers of those problems there.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to puzzle out. I guess this is probably a case-by-case basis, but the tenant would have to go, they couldn't go to the landlord, especially if the landlord's getting like the up-down or like the rating. They've lost out on that opportunity for housing because we know like stuff doesn't stay readily available. Then they would have to go back to the company and would they have to like, I'm just trying to like put myself in the shoes of a tenant and I would be very frustrated. So do you go to the landlord and say, hey, what did it say? Does the landlord have to give you the information about like where they got this reporting from?
So, first of all, I want to highlight that yes, it is very frustrating for people, especially because you typically have to pay an application fee to even apply to an apartment. So that means that
Mm.
people are having to pay over and over again. And that costs money that they may not have. And if something goes, say it was an error that caused them to lose the apartment, they have to take the time to fix the error. And like you're saying, they lost the apartment. So there is an immediate harm to someone who's trying to find housing. But in terms of your question about how do they try to fix things or find out what went wrong, the landlord is supposed to provide what's called, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, an adverse action notice. And they have to tell the tenant that they used a background screening company and provide information about it. It doesn't have to say why they denied the person. And
Mm.
the tenant could ask the landlord, hey, could you give me a copy of the report you saw? But the landlord doesn't have to do that. But under the federal law, the tenant can get it from the background screening company. They are required to provide it. But the problem in the tenant screening situation, which is, I'll say, different from the employment situation,
Mm-hmm.
is that the report that the person might get from the tenant screening company might not be identical to what the landlord saw. So you still might have issues with trying to figure out what went wrong.
I'm so frustrated, like hypothetically right now.
Yeah.
And well, I'll ask this first. How does this differ from the employment? You mentioned that there's a difference. What are like the key differences in that experience?
So in the employment context, the potential employee does get a copy of the actual report that was used. So that's different. And there's also this process that comes before they were denied called, they have to get a pre-adverse action notice, which in theory gives someone a chance to fix things, but in practice, there usually isn't enough time to do that. And then they get this adverse action notice again if they are in fact turned down, for example. So there are more protections in the employment context than in the tenant screening context. But I will say, we hear from legal aid attorneys and folks on the ground that landlords and employers aren't necessarily good about giving these notices out, even though they are required to do that.
Yeah, and I'm curious if do you know how the different paths emerge in the two areas where background checks are happening the most? Like why more technically like you're getting the pre-adverse action notice in the employment sector as opposed to housing?
I'm sure it just has to do with bargains that were made in Congress. And
Mm-hmm.
I've spent some time in the legislative history of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but I haven't specifically looked at that aspect of it. But I'm
Yeah.
guessing, you know, when the Fair Credit Reporting Act was passed, it's possible that tenant screening was less prevalent. I'm not sure. I'm wagering a guess there.
Yeah.
But, part of my advocacy is certain when I talk to folks on the Hill, part of my advocacy is certainly to say, at the least, we should provide the same protections in the tenant screening context as we do in the employment screening context. Although I will also say we need to do a lot more.
Yes, definitely. I had one more question about the process, kind of like if the recourse for applicants. Let's say, because there are multiple players in this industry, there are multiple companies offering these services. If I apply here, they have one service. I notice they have some incorrect information. Is it worth it? Do people do it? Like reaching out to other agencies to like make sure this information isn't also incorrect elsewhere? Or is it, if I fix this here, it'll be fixed everywhere? Which I feel like I'm going to be disappointed to find out that's not the case.
That's a really great question and speaks to one of the big problems we have in this space, which is there are so many companies providing these services. And it might be hard to figure out which background screening company your employer or landlord is using. And I've heard that in some rental housing markets, one tenant screening company might be used a whole lot. So in that sense, it might be easier in that particular context. But it is difficult for people to find out and then to go through the process of getting the information. And I am going to disappoint you. The information they have or the way they put together information on you might be different. So you might, even if you correct an error with one tenant screening company or employment screening company, that same error might appear with another company. And I would say I do think it could be worth it if you think there's going to be an issue to do your best to find out who these companies might be for a particular employer or landlord and try to get what's called a file disclosure. You ask them for your records. It's basically, it's like a report, but there's a different word for it under the law. Gets confusing really
Of course.
fast.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird statute. There's a lot of confusing things. But so yeah, you can get that information and try to make it better before you have to go through the application process.
And is it something like someone without a legal background could navigate easily?
Not necessarily. It is hard. You have to provide a lot of identifying information. You have to be savvy enough to figure out who the company is and what their requirements are for getting the information. And I will say this is one instance in which the background screening industry differs a lot from the credit reporting industry. And when I say credit reporting industry, I really mean what's called the big three credit bureaus: TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. And there is what's called a centralized source. And if you want to get your information, you can go to this website and you can get it. And there are also only three of them. And in this other context, we know there are potentially around over 1,000. And the market, how many of them are big players is a different question, but there are a lot of companies doing this.
Professional Background Screening Association. There is an association that exists. What do they do? Do they just like lobby? Do they try to get companies to meet certain standards? Are they a net positive in the world?
I would say I don't know that I would say they're a net positive. I'm not sure to what extent they try to enforce some standards. I think they might, but the times that I interact with them or see them the most are when they're engaging in lobbying. So say that there's been a bill introduced in a state legislature that's trying to address one of the many issues we've talked about today. I will often see that someone representing the industry association is testifying, or I will know from an individual legislator that they're talking to that legislator. So they're very much in the mix with trying to shape the law the way they want it to be. And I'll also say another big player is called the Consumer Data Industry Association. And they typically represent the big three credit bureaus, but also the background screening companies. So they too are in the mix and testifying. And they're a really powerful force. They have the ability to kill legislation, and I've seen it happen. So they're definitely a force to be reckoned with.
What kind of legislation are they trying to prevent from being enacted? Like, I'm sure it would help the people in the situations like I've hypothetically asked about, but are there any specifics you could share?
Yeah. So, say there's a state legislator who realizes there's not a lot of guidance about what reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy means.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean that a background screening company has to do, for example, in terms of the procedures it uses to match an individual with their records? I'm talking about things like name, date of birth, gender, all these things. And so say the state has its own equivalent to the federal law that has that same language and wants to require these companies to do certain things to meet that standard. I've seen those industry associations come in and say we have a problem with that, and they have a lot of problems with it. And maybe that bill goes away. Or we've seen there's been a lot of conversation about tenant screening reports because of the COVID-19 economic crisis, and people are a lot of people are going to have an eviction record that is going to appear on a tenant screening report and mean that they really struggle to get housing in the future. And so there have been a lot of bills to say, well, we shouldn't count what happened during this pandemic against people. That is not indicative of whether they'll be a successful tenant. We shouldn't be taking this into account. And there's been a lot of pushback around some of that as well.
I just keep making faces, and y'all can't see them. Ariel gets to see them in there. I'm just like, why, like, why is it so hard to hold yourself to a certain standard, like an industry standard? And why? There's a lot of things coming out of the pandemic where it's like, why did we treat people like this? Why are we going to, like you said, hold what happened in an unprecedented, hate that word, but unprecedented crisis that no one could anticipate, or really at the highest levels work through reasonable plans of action to keep people safe, as we've seen for the last 18 months. But
yeah, I mean, I'd say the answer is money.
Always.
There's a cost to doing a better job, for example, at matching people correctly. And I would say the cost is worth it and also required by law to do a better job in a lot of circumstances. But, if you actually do have to send someone to a court to pull the actual criminal record and not just an abbreviated record that you got from another source, that'll cost money. I would argue that that is appropriate, but, there's that. And it's also that the clients of these companies are not the consumers, the tenants and the employees. They're the employers and the landlords, and they want more information, not less. So there are a lot of incentives to be providing this information that are harmful to employees and tenants.
Yeah. Money ruins everything. So what about the gig economy? And I know this is such a hard left turn, but the gig economy, every time I've considered doing any sort of gig economy work, whether it's Uber, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, all of these companies, like, you do a background check. Like, you maybe scan your driver's license. I haven't tried in a long time, but I do have a suspicion that the gig economy has, like, accelerated the growth of this industry. What can you tell me about, like, how the gig economy has impacted the background check process?
Well, I will say that there are certain background screening companies that essentially cater to the gig economy. They have positioned themselves as, we provide background check services for these gig economy businesses. The biggest one that I know about is called Checker. And
is there not, did they eliminate the last E in Checker?
That's right. Yep. That's how you know that they are part of the gig economy space, is there are missing vowels.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry. It wasn't important, but I needed to know. Please continue.
No, I understand. I completely agree. And one type of product that I've seen them provide, and they're not the only ones, but they do provide it, is I believe they refer to it as a continuous background check. So this idea that people who are working for you, and I won't use the word employee here because of course that's another battle that's being fought with respect to gig economy workers, but they say, if something new crops up, a new case is filed or something happens, we'll let you know. And we do continuous checking. We make sure we're constantly monitoring them. And this strikes me as really scary and problematic for a variety of reasons, because just because a case is filed, that doesn't tell us anything. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. And it, to me, brings to mind all the problems we talked about earlier about who is being charged with offenses in our country.
Yep.
And, I think this also, we only really have talked about one type of error we see in these reports, that was mismatched records. But there are a lot of other errors that crop up, like, for example, incomplete records, a record that might not say the outcome of a case. Maybe a jury found a person innocent, or the prosecution dropped the case, or it was dismissed. There are all sorts of outcomes in a criminal case that are not a conviction, or a guilty plea, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible, and these reports sometimes don't reflect that. And that's really problematic for people as well.
Two comments/questions. First, the continuous observation or continuous updates, that just seems scary. Like, I would not want to opt into that. And I feel like there has to be, I don't feel like there has to be, but I would hope there would be something where people are like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to opt out of that one. But two, like you mentioned earlier, that the companies don't want to go the extra mile to like verify the information. You also mentioned that like these gig economy companies, they're not employees, they're contracted workers. Like, nobody wants to pay the costs to do the job correctly. Like, and if we don't pay, we won't be profitable. Then like your business model is broken. That's not the people who need this fault. But ultimately, my question is, at the end of all of that, like, why don't these companies just charge more to like make that a part of the package? Oh, sometimes information's wrong. If you want us to go to the courthouse to verify, that's like an extra package, like another tier or something.
I think they could. I think one concern I would have overall is we don't want to be passing that cost on to the person who's being screened. And I don't know that we have a lot of information about what portion of, say, a rental application fee is actually the cost of the background check. If you're a
Mm-hmm.
big client of one of these companies, I'm guessing you probably get a pretty reasonable rate, and
Yeah.
I'm sure a company like Uber is getting a reasonable rate if they use from Checker. So, I think they could charge more. These companies can afford it, and if they can't, then that's a bigger problem. For that should not be the problem of the people who are trying to be employed.
Yeah. And final thing you mentioned, just like the outcome of cases not being on the record. It's like, that's crazy because like things happen all the time. You interact with the law. You might, I don't know if like civil stuff shows up, but like if someone sees you, I don't know. I don't like this at all. And I knew that reading the report, but hearing you say it just
Yeah.
makes me dislike it
And
even more.
yeah, and I think it might be worth just mentioning a few more other bad things that happen to really lay it on, I guess. So another thing that we see sometimes is the reporting of records that have been sealed or expunged. And this one makes me really angry because, first of all, you have a state who has said, we want certain records to be invisible or cleared. We don't want this to hold someone back in getting a job, for example. It's a second chance concept. And then the person, in a lot of places, more and more, there's automatic record clearing, but for the most part, people have to go through this whole process to get their record sealed or expunged. And then they go to apply for a job. They think they're home free. And then the background screening company reports that record. That is just the absolute opposite of everything this was supposed to do. And that's devastating.
Yes. So in that instance, I'm being very litigious. Can I go sue the state for doing that, for releasing that information?
So it wouldn't be the state, but yeah, it would be you would sue the background screening company.
Okay, the background screening company. Got it. Just
And a
making
lot
notes.
of times, a lot of times that happens because a company they're using a bunch of bulk data to run their reports. And they didn't check to see if there had been any updates. So they created a report based on old data.
Yeah, so maybe instead of constantly updating me as I go through life, you need to update the system you're getting from whoever you're buying it from. I'm fixing the whole system right now.
Great point. Great,
yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sure you've had all these conversations already. I'm just thinking out loud. So have we missed any of the problems with background checks? We talked about like including the sealed or expunged records. I'm trying to think through the stories from your report too.
Yeah.
Names, like you mentioned, date of birth, like partial date of birth, partial Social Security, like just partial records being an issue, not updating the information. I also have. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say another couple of things to flag are, say you have a misdemeanor on your offense, but that gets reported as a felony. That's a problem that could happen. Or it could be lower down. It was the lowest level of offense, like an infraction, but it was classified as a misdemeanor, which means that you're disqualified from this job. We see that. And I will say that that's a whole other space of problems because there are so many different names for offenses around the country. All the states have their different systems and their different names for things. And what these companies have to do is go in and say, this is how we're going to classify things from around the country. Because when the employer goes to the drop-down menu on the online interface, there's not going to be 10,000 different names for things. They're going to have distilled them into these categories. And do we trust the company to have done that correctly? I don't, who are their experts deciding what these things are? So that's another layer where problems happen.
I can't help but think standardizing this process there's still issues with the criminal justice system, but standardizing the process here could alleviate some of the problems caused. Okay, so I think that's terrible. All of that is terrible. Oh, I do have one more question before we start talking about solutions. I also saw that everybody likes artificial intelligence, AI, autonomous machine learning to streamline the process. We know, if you don't know, that can be very sexist, racist, misogynistic. You see it in credit scores. Like there's a guy a few years ago, him and his wife each applied for an Apple Card and he got a higher limit, even though she made more and had a higher credit score. You see it in Zooms, like Zoom couldn't even detect backgrounds for some people of color to do like the background, so you don't have to be showing people your business. Just the bias in like the search results. If you search Black women versus Asian women versus white women, technology isn't the great equalizer we had hoped and it had been sold as. So what does autonomous learning, machine learning, all of that nonsense do? How are these companies trying to leverage that and say we're doing good? And what is the bad that is actually happening?
So I'm going to have to restrain myself because there's a lot to say about all of this. But the first thing I'll say is that, and this speaks to a lot of the issues we've raised here, is that we, the general public, don't actually know a lot about what these companies are doing. And that is because they say they're trade secrets, it's proprietary. So we don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know a lot. If you sue them, you, the lawyer, will get some information, but then you, the lawyer, can't share that information. So a lot of it is guessing and looking at promotional materials and things like that. And a lot of companies say, we use AI. And is that true? Is it actually AI? I don't know. I can't see behind the scenes. But assuming that it is, a lot of what they say is this means we can get you your screening report really fast. And a lot of that is that they're using some sort of algorithm, possibly AI, to run someone's name through a giant database of criminal records, for example. And some companies just use that automated process and spit out the report. No human comes back and says, it's pretty obvious that this record doesn't belong to this person. Some companies are better about that and they do have a human take a look. And, that's why I would say that AI in that context isn't inherently bad. If you have human checks, if you have other things, that automation isn't necessarily terrible. It could be,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily. So there's that. The other place that I've seen claims about AI being used are in this context I mentioned before, which is categorizing and filtering criminal records. I've seen some companies say that they are using AI to do that. And I would be concerned about whether that AI is doing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And, a third category that I'll mention is I said something about tenant screening scores before. And that's another place where there's some sort of number that's spit out. It's not a credit score, it's its own thing. It's its own thing that is not regulated the way that credit scores are. So we don't know if it's predictive, we don't know what's going into it. So I would say is that something like that probably has the ability to be using AI to reflect and perpetuate all sorts of racial disparities, for example.
Well, again, this conversation just makes me more and more sad, but let's talk about solutions. I need to pick me up to end this call. What are some of the solutions your team is working on? And you may not have the weight to throw around that this, whatever the professional association was called, what are some of the solutions if there are aspiring landlords listening to this, how can they make sure they're treating potential tenants and even hiring managers? How can they treat potential employees with respect throughout the process and recognize that these services aren't fail-proof?
So I'll just say this, and that's that I think folks at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, at the agency level, all these, there's ways to improve things through all those mechanisms, and
Mm-hmm.
that it's important to do all of them. Like we were talking about before with respect to how the Fair Credit Reporting Act treats employment and tenant screening differently. The baseline is there should be as many protections for tenant screening. But
Mm-hmm.
I think one solution that's important to highlight up front, and I know I raised some problems with it, but it is that record clearing is really important because it's a way to it's a really good way to just take a great stab at keeping things off a report. If the background screening companies and the employers aren't making a decision about that, that's great. It's just kind of a frontline solution. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, there is a possibility that they could be reported, but there are certain places where they've actually done a really good job at preventing that. And to circle back to where we started, I talked about these contracts where a background screening company can subscribe to bulk records from a court system. And in Pennsylvania, what they've done is say, well, if you are buying our bulk data, you also have to use this particular file that then has extracted cases that have been sealed or expunged. And that's the file you have to use when you make your reports. And what I've heard from advocates on the ground there is that it's actually been pretty effective at preventing the reporting of sealed or expunged records. And, it's also the state has said we don't want certain records to be considered by people like employers or landlords. So I would say that record sealing is a really it kind of cuts across a lot of issue areas we've been talking about. It's not, a change to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's sort of bigger than that in some ways,
Yeah.
but that's a really key solution.
Okay. So I think we covered it. What background checks are supposed to do, what they're actually doing, the problems with background checks, and a nice solution. One
of many.
One part of the puzzle. But I mean, you got to start somewhere, and big changes are scary to rich people. So can't overwhelm them too much.
I will say, I want to say something about record clearing, which is that second chance legislation, which they sometimes call it, or clean slate, is kind of appealing to a lot of different folks. It's sort of, Checker, for example, has said that it's behind second chance initiatives. So maybe this is a one step that we can take that is politically appealing and feasible in a lot of ways. So that's why I named that one of the many others I could list.
There we go. So it's, we're trying to work with everybody, right? It's not just making fun of their name. That's me. Ariel's coming with real solutions, and these are the kind of people we need. I just offer the snark. I do have one final question. Could be related to background checks, doesn't have to be. This show is That Can't Be Right. What is something you've come across? It can't be the pandemic, unfortunately. We know that can't be right. Or responses to the pandemic in Texas, sad face, or Florida. What is something that you've read, seen, heard, been discussed in your home or group chats that can't be right? It can be big, it can be small. Food, culture, policy, have at it.
This is maybe a non-exciting answer because it does connect with my work and what we've been talking about here, but it just can't be right that folks who suffered during the pandemic because they lost a job, something that was not their fault at all, is then used to make it hard or impossible for them to get a home. That just is not right. And there are so many stories in the news right now about people that's happening to. And it is not tenable for us to go on like that. What are you going to do with these potentially millions of people for whom that has happened?
Right. As a country, we already treat people without homes, without housing pretty poorly. And we are setting ourselves up to create more of those people without the safety nets, again, dignity and respect they deserve to be treated with, because like you're saying, it wasn't their fault. So no, not a boring answer at all.
That's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's the news is hard to watch sometimes, but y'all, we have come to the end of the discussion. I will include a link to the report I read in the episode description, and I hope you all will read it, and I hope you'll read the stories about actual people who were impacted by this system. But where else can we find you on the internet, or what else should people be paying attention to from your end of the world?
Well, I do not have a great internet Twitter presence, for example, but my organization is at NCLC for consumers. So check out a lot of our work. I also just want to lift up this really great online publication called The Markup that did a whole series of really great stories about problems with tenant screening. So check that out. One of their reports was with the New York Times. It's just incredible and heartbreaking. So check them out too.
Awesome. Y'all, that is it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, at TCBR Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure you're subscribed. If you loved this conversation, leave a review. 5 stars, Apple Podcasts, please. That's it. Thank you so much, Ariel.
Thank you.